April 14, 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing. The landscape of Germany is a vision of hell. Cities are burning. Roads are clogged with refugees. The once mighty Wehrmacht is surrendering in droves. But for the soldiers of the US 89th Infantry Division, known as the Rolling W, the war is not over yet. They are pushing deep into Thuringia, part of General Patton's Third Army. Every town they enter is a gamble. Will there be white flags hanging from the windows? Or will there be a fanatical SS unit waiting with a Panzerfaust? The tension is suffocating. Their objective is the town of Friedrich-Roda. Intelligence reports have flagged this area as critical. But the soldiers aren't looking for gold or art. They are looking for wonder weapons. Rumors have been flying for months about Hitler's secret projects. Rockets that fall from space, jets that fly without propellers. But nothing could prepare these men for what they were about to find inside the Gothaer Wagenfabrik. The factory complex is quiet. The Allied bombing raids have missed this specific workshop. The German workers and guards have fled hours before the Americans arrived, leaving tools scattered on the floor and half-eaten meals on the tables. The soldiers kick open the heavy industrial doors. Flashlights cut through the dusty gloom. They move past half-finished aircraft fuselages, past piles of blueprints. And then, in the center of the main assembly hall, they stop. Looming out of the darkness is a shape that defies every rule of aviation they know. It doesn't look like a machine built by humans in the 1940s. It looks like something that crashed from another planet. It has no tail fin. It has no long fuselage. It has no propellers. It is a single, massive, continuous wing. A giant charcoal grey boomerang sitting on a tricycle landing gear. The soldiers walk around it in awe. It looks predatory, like a bat waiting to take off. This was the Horten Ho 229 V3, the nearly completed prototype of the world's first jet-powered flying wing. An intelligence officer steps forward to inspect the beast. He looks into the massive air intakes. "Jets," he whispers. Inside the wing roots, he sees two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines. These were the same engines used on the Me-262, but here they are buried inside the body of the plane. The design is sleek, smooth, and aerodynamic. It looks fast, just sitting on the ground. But then, the officer does something strange. He reaches out and knocks on the nose of the aircraft. Thud, thud. The sound isn't the metallic ring of aluminum. It's a dull, organic thud. The soldiers look at each other, confused. They touch the wings. They peel back a piece of the grey paint. Underneath the high-tech charcoal coating, they find the plywood. The most advanced aircraft in history, a machine capable of nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour, is made of wood and glue. It seems like a contradiction, a paradox. Why would the Nazis, masters of steel and engineering, build their ultimate weapon out of furniture material? Was it desperation? Or was it something else? The Americans didn't know it yet, but they had just stumbled upon the holy grail of stealth technology. The carbon-infused glue and the wooden skin were not just due to a lack of metal. They were designed to absorb radar waves. This machine was designed to be a ghost. While Allied bombers were giant metal targets on German radar screens, this wooden bat was designed to slip through the net unseen. The soldiers of the 89th Division quickly secured the perimeter. They knew this was big. They called in the T-Force, the specialized technical units tasked with stealing Nazi secrets. General Hap Arnold, the head of the US Army Air Forces, would later look at the photos of this machine and realize the terrifying truth. If the war had lasted 6 months longer, this machine could have changed everything. Imagine fleets of these invisible bombers appearing over London or New York without warning. No radar blips, no time to scramble Spitfires or Mustangs, just destruction raining from the sky. But as the Americans tagged the aircraft for shipment back to the USA, part of what would become Operation Paperclip, a question remained. Who built this? This didn't look like the work of Messerschmitt or Fokker-Wulf. Those companies built traditional planes. This was the work of outsiders, visionaries, or perhaps madmen. To understand the Ho 229, we have to leave the dark hangar of 1945 and go back to the beginning. We have to meet two brothers who hated tails. Two brothers who believed that the entire history of aviation was wrong. Reimar and Walter Horten. While other kids played with toy soldiers, they were obsessed with a single radical idea, the pure wing, and they were about to convince Hermann Göring to bet the fate of the Luftwaffe on their dream. To understand why the Horten Ho 229 looked like an alien spacecraft, we have to understand the strange world in which Reimar and Walter Horten grew up. They were born into a Germany that had just lost World War I. The country was humiliated. The economy was destroyed. And most importantly, for two boys obsessed with flying, the Treaty of Versailles had banned Germany from having an air force. Powered military aircraft were forbidden. But the treaty said nothing about gliders. This loophole created a golden age of silent flight. Since they couldn't build engines, German engineers became the masters of aerodynamics. They learned to ride the wind. They learned that to stay in the air without an engine, you need efficiency. You need to eliminate every ounce of drag. Reimar and Walter were not typical engineers. They didn't go to prestigious technical universities to learn the rules. They were teenagers who joined the Bonn Glider Club in 1925. They were rebels. While other designers were building biplanes with wires and struts and boxy fuselages, the Horten brothers looked at birds. They looked at the albatross. They noticed something simple but profound. Birds don't have vertical tail fins sticking up from their backs. Reimar, the younger brother, and the mathematical genius of the pair, became obsessed with a single idea: the parasitic drag. He calculated that on a normal airplane, the fuselage, the body, the tail, and the landing gear contributed 30% to 50% of the drag, but created zero lift. They were dead weight. They were simply structures used to hold the pilot and the tail fin. Reimar asked a radical question. What if we get rid of them? What if the entire airplane is just one giant wing? The flying wing concept wasn't new. Hugo Junkers had patented it in 1910, but nobody had made it work properly. Without a tail, planes were unstable. They would flip over and crash. Reimar believed he could solve this with math. He didn't have a wind tunnel. He didn't have a laboratory. He had his parents' house. In a story that sounds like a movie script, the Horten brothers turned their family's living room and dining room into a workshop. Imagine the scene. The furniture pushed to the walls, sawdust covering the expensive rugs, the smell of glue and varnish filling the house, two teenage boys cutting wood and gluing fabric, building a machine that would eventually challenge the laws of physics. In 1933, they finished their first prototype, the Horten HI. It was made of wood and linen. It had no tail. It was controlled by elevons, flaps on the wings, and strange drag rudders that popped out of the wingtips. They took it to the airfield at Bonn Hangar. It didn't look like it should fly. It looked like a boomerang. But when they launched it, it soared. It was incredibly efficient. It glided further and faster than conventional gliders because it sliced through the air with minimal resistance. But the German aviation establishment hated them. The experts at Messerschmitt and Heinkel laughed at the Horten brothers and their toys. They called them amateurs. They said a flying wing would never be stable enough for combat. Walter Horten, the older brother, was the fighter. He joined the Luftwaffe as a pilot. He flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109 in the Battle of Britain. He saw firsthand how easily German planes were being shot down. He saw that the Luftwaffe needed speed. He realized that his brother's toy glider, if given an engine, could be faster than anything the British had. By 1943, the war had turned against Germany. The cities were being bombed. The Luftwaffe was losing. The arrogance of the established aircraft companies began to crack. They needed a miracle. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, issued a challenge that seemed impossible. It was called the 3X-1000 project. He wanted a bomber that could carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs, fly 1,000 kilometers deep into enemy territory, and reach a speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour. None of the major companies, not Messerschmitt, not Junkers, not Heinkel, could do it. Their conventional designs created too much drag. If they added big engines for speed, they burned too much fuel for the range. If they added fuel for the range, they were too heavy for the speed. It was a physics trap. Walter Horten heard about the requirement. He went to Reimar and said, "This is it. This is what the wing was made for." Reimar ran the numbers. A conventional plane has a drag coefficient of 0.04. His flying wing had a drag coefficient of roughly 0.02. It had half the resistance. He realized that with the new jet engines that were being developed, a flying wing was the only design that could meet Göring's impossible numbers. They didn't have an official contract. They didn't have a factory. They had a garage mentality and a dream. They drew up the plans for the Horten Ho, which would become the Ho 229. They were about to walk into a meeting with the most powerful and dangerous men in the Nazi regime and tell them that the entire aviation industry was wrong, and they were going to do it with a model made of wood. Late 1943. The mood in the German High Command is black. The war has turned. The Allied bombing campaign is systematically erasing German cities from the map. Every night, hundreds of British Lancaster bombers incinerate industrial zones. Every day, huge formations of American B-17 flying fortresses block out the sun. The Luftwaffe, once the terrifying ruler of the skies, is paralyzed. Their standard fighters like the Bf-109 and FW-190 are struggling to catch the high-flying Americans. They have a new weapon on the horizon, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first jet fighter. It is fast, terrifyingly fast, but it has a fatal flaw. Its early jet engines burn fuel at an insane rate. It can only stay in the air for 30 to 40 minutes. It is a sprinter, not a marathon runner. It cannot penetrate deep into England to destroy the bombers on the ground. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, is desperate. He is a man losing his grip on reality, addicted to morphine and living in stolen luxury. But he knows one thing. If he doesn't stop the bombers, Hitler will destroy him. So Göring issues a challenge that sounds like a fairy tale. It is known as the 3X1000 project. He demands a bomber that can carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs. It must fly 1,000 kilometers deep into enemy territory and return. And it must fly at 1,000 kilometers per hour. To the engineers at Junkers and Heinkel, this is a joke. It is mathematically impossible with 1943 technology. Think about the physics. To fly at 1,000 km/h, you need massive jet engines. Massive jet engines are heavy and thirsty. To feed them for 1,000 kilometers, you need tons of fuel. To carry that fuel, you need a bigger wingspan and a bigger fuselage. That creates more drag. More drag slows you down. It is a vicious cycle, the snake eating its own tail. Conventional aircraft design had hit a brick wall. You could have speed, or you could have range. You could not have both. Enter the Horten brothers. Walter and Reimar Horten looked at the 3X1000 requirements and realized that everyone else was looking at the problem wrong. The problem wasn't the engine. The problem was the airplane. Every square inch of surface area on a plane creates friction, drag. The fuselage is drag. The tail is drag. The rivets are drag. Reimar calculated that if you removed the tail and the body, leaving only the wing, you reduced the drag by nearly 50%. A flying wing didn't need more fuel to go further. It glided on the air. It required less power to achieve the same speed. It was the only shape in existence that could break the 3X1000 paradox. They secured a meeting with Hermann Göring. This was a dangerous gamble. Göring was volatile. If he thought they were wasting his time, they could be sent to the Eastern Front. The brothers walked into the room. They weren't backed by a huge corporation. They brought sketches and their glider data. They presented the design for the Horten Ho. It looked bizarre. No tail. Engines buried inside the wing root, pilot sitting right in the nose. Göring looked at the design. He looked at the numbers. For the first time in months, he saw a glimmer of hope. He didn't care that it looked like a bat. He cared that Reimar promised it could outrun anything the Allies had and reach London. Göring slammed his fist on the table. He didn't just approve it, he gave it the highest priority. He ordered an immediate prototype. But there was a catch. He wanted it now. The brothers raced back to their workshop in Göttingen. They had the green light, but they had a massive problem. Materials. By 1944, Germany was running out of strategic metals. Duralumin, aviation-grade aluminum, was scarce. Steel was needed for tanks. They couldn't build this high-tech jet out of metal. So they made a decision that sounds insane to modern ears. They would build the jet of the future out of furniture. The main structure would be a welded steel tube frame, easy to make, but the entire skin of the aircraft, the wings, the nose, the control surfaces, would be made of plywood. Specifically, multiple layers of wood glued together with a special resin. This necessity became the mother of the greatest secret of the war. Reimar Horten was not just worried about aerodynamics, he was worried about radar. The British radar network, Chain Home, had won the Battle of Britain. It could see German planes coming from miles away because metal reflects radar waves like a mirror reflects light. Reimar wondered, does wood reflect radar? Not as much as metal, but he wanted to go further. He wanted to make the plane absorb the waves. He began to experiment with the glue. He took the standard sawdust and glue mixture used to bond the plywood sheets, and he added a secret ingredient: charcoal dust, carbon. Why charcoal? Because carbon conducts electricity. Reimar theorized that if the electromagnetic radar waves hit this layer of carbon-infused glue hidden between the wood sheets, the energy would be dissipated as tiny amounts of heat rather than bouncing back to the radar station. It was a primitive form of what we now call RAM, radar-absorbent material. The B-2 Spirit bomber today uses high-tech composite materials to do exactly the same thing. Reimar Horten was trying to do it with soot and sawdust in a garage in 1944. He called it a sandwich construction, a core of wood covered in this carbon glue sealed with paint. The workers building the prototype had no idea why they were mixing black dust into the glue. They just followed orders. But Reimar believed he was building the ultimate predator, a plane faster than any fighter, capable of carrying bombs to England, and crucially, invisible to the electronic eyes of the enemy. As the prototype took shape in the garage, it looked less like a weapon of war and more like a sculpture. But the clock was ticking. The Allies were advancing. The prototype, named the Ho 229 V1, a glider version without engines, was ready to prove the concept. If it crashed, the dream was over. If it flew, the Horten brothers would change history. They dragged the wooden monster out to the runway at Göttingen. It was time to see if the math was real. Spring 1944. The windy airfield at Göttingen. The Horten brothers had built their monster. The HYX V1 stood on the runway. It had no engines yet. It was a pure glider, designed to test if a 16-meter wooden boomerang could actually stay stable in the air without flipping over and killing its pilot. The test pilot climbed into the cockpit. He was sitting right in the nose, surrounded by plexiglass, with the massive wings sweeping back behind him. A tow plane pulled it down the runway. The cable snapped tight. The wooden wing lifted off the grass. It didn't just fly, it soared. Without the drag of a fuselage or tail, it sliced through the air with terrifying efficiency. When the tow cable was released, the V1 glided silently over the German countryside. It landed perfectly. Reimar Horten had proven the aerodynamics. The bell-shaped lift distribution, his complex mathematical theory, worked. The bird didn't need a tail. But a glider is not a weapon of war. Göring didn't want a kite. He wanted a bomber. It was time to add the fire. The brothers moved to the next prototype, the HYX V2. This was the Frankenstein moment. They took the wooden frame and cut massive holes in the wing roots. They installed two Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines. These were the same engines used in the famous Messerschmitt Me-262. But on the Me-262, the engines hung in pods under the wing. On the Horten, they were buried inside the wing, right next to the pilot. The heat was intense. They had to insulate the wooden skin with special heat-resistant varnish to stop the plane from catching fire in mid-air. It was a flying bomb, jet fuel, hot engines and plywood, all packed into a tight shell. December 18th, 1944. The V2 is ready. The man chosen to tame this beast was Lieutenant Erwin Ziller. Ziller was an experienced Luftwaffe pilot, a man of nerves of steel. He knew exactly what he was getting into. He knew that if this experimental shape lost stability, there was no recovering. A flying wing that enters a spin is like a falling leaf. It is uncontrollable. He fired up the Jumo engines. The roar was deafening. Blue flames spat out of the exhausts at the back of the wing. Ziller released the brakes. The Ho 229 accelerated down the runway. It lifted off. History was made. The world's first jet-powered flying wing was airborne. The flight reports from those early tests are astonishing. Because the Ho 229 had so little drag, it accelerated faster than the Me-262. It handled beautifully. But the real shock came when they simulated combat. In a mock dogfight scenario, the Ho 229 was pitted against the standard German fighters and even the Me-262. The results stunned the observers. The flying wing could turn tighter. It retained its energy better in a turn. Why? Because it didn't have a giant tail acting as an air brake. It was the perfect predator. It was faster, more agile and harder to see on radar than anything else in the sky. For a brief moment in early 1945, it looked like the Horten brothers had actually done it. They had built the wonder weapon that could save the Reich. But experimental aviation is a cruel game. February 26, 1945. A cold, grey day. Erwin Ziller took the V-2 up for its third test flight. He climbed to altitude. He performed a series of maneuvers. Everything looked perfect. Then, disaster struck. One of the Jumo 004 engines flamed out. It died instantly. On a normal plane with a tail like the Me-262, losing an engine is dangerous, but you can use the rudder on the tail to fight the yaw, the plane trying to turn sideways. The Ho 229 had no tail. It had no rudder. With the right engine dead and the left engine pushing full power, the asymmetric thrust violently twisted the aircraft. Ziller was fighting for his life. He wrestled with the stick. He tried to dive to restart the engine using the airflow, a windmill start. He could have bailed out. He had a radio. He could have ejected the canopy and jumped. But Erwin Ziller was a test pilot. He knew that this was the only jet prototype they had. If he crashed, the program would be set back by months. And Germany didn't have months. He tried to save the plane. He brought it down towards the airfield. He lowered the landing gear. But the instability was too great. The Bat stalled. It rolled over and slammed into the frozen ground just short of the runway. The wooden structure shattered. Ziller was thrown from the wreckage. He died 2 weeks later in the hospital from his injuries. The V-2 was a pile of smoking matchsticks. The dream seemed dead. But in a factory in Friedrichroda, the Horten brothers were already building the V-3. The V-3 was bigger. It was the production version. It was the bomber that would attack England. And it was nearly finished. Reimar Horten didn't stop to mourn. He worked harder. He believed that if he could just get the V-3 into the air, the death of Ziller wouldn't be in vain. But he wasn't the only one watching the clock. Hundreds of kilometers to the west, General Patton's tanks were crossing the Rhine. The race was no longer about aerodynamics. It was a race against time. The Americans were coming. April 1945. The Third Reich is dead, but the war for the future has just begun. While the infantry soldiers were fighting for ruins and street corners, a different kind of war was being fought in the shadows. This was the war of the T-forces, target forces. These were special units of the Allied armies, composed of scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers carrying machine guns. Their orders came directly from the highest levels of the Pentagon and Whitehall. Their mission was not to kill Nazis. Their mission was to steal their brains. They carried blacklists, lists of German scientists, prototypes, and research documents that had to be captured at all costs. Top of the list was Werner von Braun and his V-2 rockets, but close behind were the secrets of the Luftwaffe's jet program. The Americans knew something terrifying. The war with Germany was ending, but a Cold War with the Soviet Union was brewing. Stalin's Red Army was advancing from the east like a tidal wave. The map of post-war Germany had already been drawn at the Yalta Conference. The state of Thuringia, where the Gotha factory and the Horten workshop were located, was designated to become part of the Soviet occupation zone. The Americans had a problem. They were physically in Thuringia now, but they would have to withdraw in a few weeks to let the Russians take over. They had a strict deadline. They had to strip the region of every single piece of advanced technology before the Russians arrived. It was the greatest looting operation in history. April 14, 1945. The troops of the US 8 Corps secure the Gothaer Wagenfabrik in Friedrichroda. Inside, as we saw in Part 1, they found the Horten Ho 229 V3. It was nearly finished. The center section, the cockpit and engines, was complete. The massive wooden wings were sitting on stands nearby, ready to be attached. The T-Force officers arrived in jeeps. They looked at the strange Batwing aircraft. They didn't just see a plane, they saw a leap in technology. Colonel Harold E. Watson, the man in charge of collecting German jets, his team was famously called Watson's Whizzers, ordered the aircraft to be seized immediately. But capturing the machine was the easy part. Catching the creators was harder. Reimar and Walter Horten were not waiting at the factory. They were smart. They knew the game. They had fled. They were moving across Germany, trying to negotiate their own surrender. They didn't want to be captured by the Soviets. They knew that meant a one-way ticket to a gulag in Siberia. They wanted to surrender to the British or Americans. Reimar Horten was eventually arrested by the Americans. The interrogation was fascinating. The Americans expected a fanatic Nazi. Instead, they found a mathematician. When asked about the wooden construction, Reimar explained the radar-absorbing glue. The American intelligence officers were stunned. They filed a report that classified the Ho 229 as the most radical aircraft design of the entire war. Back at the factory, the clock was ticking. The Russians were coming. The T-Force had to figure out how to move a 16-meter-wide flying wing across a war-torn continent. They couldn't fly it out, it wasn't flight-tested, and no American pilot knew how to handle a tailless jet. They had to box it up. American mechanics, cursing the strange German design, disassembled the V3. They detached the outer wings. They removed the Jumo 04 jet engines. They carefully packed the center section onto a flatbed railway car. It was a logistical nightmare. The convoy had to navigate bombed-out bridges and roads clogged with refugees. This operation was part of Operation Paperclip, the secret US program to bring German scientists and technology to America to build the next generation of weapons. While von Braun went to build NASA rockets, the Ho 229 was destined for a darker journey. It was shipped to the port of Cherbourg in France. There, it was loaded onto the British aircraft carrier HMS Reaper, along with several Me-262s and other prizes, and shipped across the Atlantic. Imagine the scene. A wooden Nazi aircraft designed to bomb New York, arriving in New York Harbor not as a conqueror, but as a prisoner of war. It was unloaded and sent to the US Navy for evaluation. But here is where the story takes a mysterious turn. The US Air Force and Navy studied it. They marveled at the design. And then, they hid it. They didn't put it in a museum. They didn't show it to the press. They crated it up and buried it in a government warehouse in Silver Hill, Maryland. It sat there gathering dust for decades. Why? Conspiracy theorists argue that it was hidden because the US government didn't want to admit how advanced the Nazis really were. But the truth is more practical. Jack Northrop was building his own flying wings in America, the XB-35 and YB-49. The US military wanted to study the German data in secret to see if the Horten brothers had solved the stability problems that were killing American pilots. The Ho 229 V3 disappeared into the darkness of the Smithsonian storage facility. The world forgot about the Nazi stealth fighter. But the idea didn't die. 40 years later, a new shape emerged from a secret hangar in California. A shape that looked suspiciously familiar. The B-2 Spirit bomber. Was it a coincidence? Or was the DNA of the Horten Ho 229 resurrected in the most expensive aircraft ever built? While the Horten Ho 229 was gathering dust in a secret government warehouse in Maryland, thousands of miles away in California, another visionary was fighting the same battle as the Horten brothers. His name was Jack Northrop. Like Reimar Horten, Northrop was obsessed with the purity of the flying wing. He believed that tails and fuselages were obsolete. In the late 1940s, he built massive, majestic flying wings for the US Air Force, the XB-35 and the jet-powered YB-49. They were beautiful. They looked like silver boomerangs dominating the sky. But Jack Northrop faced the same demons as the Germans. Without the advanced computers we have today, his flying wings were unstable. They were difficult to fly. The US Air Force pilots complained that the aircraft hunted in the air, wobbling like a falling leaf. In 1949, the government made a brutal decision. They cancelled Jack Northrop's program, but they didn't just cancel it, they erased it. In a heartbreaking act of industrial vandalism, the Air Force ordered all the flying wing prototypes to be cut up for scrap metal. Jack Northrop watched as his life's work was bulldozed. He famously broke down and wept. The world decided that the flying wing was a failure, a dead end. The Horten Ho 229 and the Northrop YB-49 were both relegated to the trash heap of history. We are uncovering the lost secrets of military engineering that history tried to forget. If you want to see more deep-dive documentaries about the machines that changed the world, please click the subscribe button and turn on the bell. Join the War Forge and help us keep this history alive. For 30 years, the concept slept. The Cold War froze aviation design into a standard shape: tube body, wings, tail. But in the shadows, the rules of war were changing again. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union developed terrifyingly powerful radar networks and surface-to-air missiles. The US Air Force realized that their B-52s and B-1s were sitting ducks. They couldn't fly fast enough or low enough to survive. They needed a plane that was invisible. They launched the Advanced Technology Bomber, ATB program. The code word was stealth. Engineers at Northrop, the company Jack founded, fed the radar equations into their supercomputers. They asked the computer, "What is the perfect shape to deflect radar waves?" The computer crunched the numbers for days, and when the answer came back, the engineers were stunned. The computer didn't design a plane with a tail. It didn't design a needle-shaped rocket. It designed a flying wing. Specifically, a shape that looked almost exactly like the charcoal sketches drawn by Reimar Horten in a German garage in 1944. In 1988, the hangar doors at Palmdale, California, opened. The world gasped. Rolling out onto the tarmac was the B-2 Spirit. It was a charcoal-grey bat-winged monster. No tail, buried engines, composite materials. It was the Horten Ho 229, reborn on a massive scale. The similarities were uncanny. Both aircraft used the continuous curve design. Both buried the engines deep inside the wing to hide the heat signature. Both used radar-absorbent materials, RAM, in the leading edges. And most controversially, both had the exact same centerline lift distribution logic. Aviation historians and conspiracy theorists went wild. Did the US steal the design? We know for a fact that engineers from Northrop visited the Smithsonian storage facility in Silver Hill, Maryland, in the early 1980s. They went there to look at the captured Horten Ho 229 V3. They crawled over the wooden skeleton. They measured the sweep angles. They studied Reimar Horten's notes on stability. Critics say the B-2 is just a high-tech copy of the Nazi jet, but the truth is more nuanced and more impressive. Physics is universal. The laws of aerodynamics don't care if you are a Nazi in 1944 or an American in 1988. If you want to be invisible to radar, the flying wing is simply the correct answer. Reimar Horten had discovered the truth of physics with a slide rule 40 years before computers confirmed it. There is a touching legend about this. Shortly before his death in 1981, Jack Northrop, now old, sick, and unable to speak, was given a security clearance. He was taken into a secret room and shown the model of the upcoming B-2 bomber. He held the model of the flying wing in his hands. He saw that the Air Force had finally accepted his dream. He wrote on a piece of paper, "Now I know why God has kept me alive this long." But while Jack Northrop got his redemption, the Horten brothers did not. Reimar Horten died in Argentina, still insisting that he was the true father of stealth. But was he right? Was the wooden Ho 229 actually stealthy, or was it just a myth? There was only one way to find out. In 2008, a team of engineers decided to do the impossible. They would build a full-scale replica of the Nazi bat and blast it with radar. The year is 2008. The debate has raged for decades. Was the Horten Ho 229 truly a stealth fighter, or was it just a lucky design made of wood? Reimar Horten, before he died, claimed that the charcoal-infused glue and the shape made it invisible to British radar. Critics called him a liar, saying he invented the stealth story later to impress the Americans. There was only one way to settle the argument: build it and test it. In a remarkable collaboration, the National Geographic Channel partnered with the one company on Earth that knows more about stealth than anyone else: Northrop Grumman. The same engineers who maintain the B-2 Spirit bomber were given a strange mission. Go back to 1944, build the Nazi jet using the original materials, and then attack it with radar. The project took place in the Mojave Desert at Northrop's highly classified Taejon RCS test range. This is usually where they test top-secret US military drones. But for this project, the hangar was occupied by a wooden ghost. The team of engineers, led by Tom DeBrenz, didn't just build a fiberglass model. They were obsessive. They wanted to test the physics, not just the shape. They went to the Smithsonian Museum to measure the surviving V-3 prototype with lasers. They analyzed the original plywood skin to determine the exact thickness, 16 millimeter in some places. And crucially, they analyzed the glue. They found that Reimar was telling the truth. The glue really was mixed with a form of carbon soot. Construction was a nightmare. The Northrop engineers, used to building with titanium and carbon fiber, had to learn how to be carpenters. They cut the wood. They mixed the glue. They built a full-scale, 55-foot-wide replica of the Ho 229. It was heavy. It was solid. And when they rolled it out into the desert sun, it looked terrifying. Even without engines just sitting on the pylon, it looked like a weapon from Star Wars. Now came the moment of truth. The engineers mounted the replica on a giant pole in the middle of the radar range. They pointed an electromagnetic generator at it. They set the frequencies to match the chain-home radar system used by the British in World War II. This was the key. Modern stealth planes are designed to defeat high-frequency radar, missile lock. But the Horten had to defeat the low-frequency, long-wave radar of the 1940s. The technicians cleared the area. The radar was switched on. The waves hit the wooden bat. The computers in the control room crunched the data. The result? It was not invisible. If you were expecting the plane to disappear completely like a ghost, that's Hollywood, not physics. But the result was still shocking. The data showed that the Horten Ho 229 had a significantly smaller radar cross-section, RCS, than a standard fighter like the Me-109 or the P-51 Mustang. Specifically, the frontal RCS was roughly 40% that of a conventional fighter. The flying wing shape naturally deflected the radar waves away from the receiver, and the carbon glue wood sandwich did absorb some of the energy. 40% smaller might not sound like stealth, but in war, math is a matter of life and death. The historians crunched the numbers on what this would mean for the Battle of Britain. Against a standard German bomber, the British radar operators would see the blip on their screens at a range of 100 miles, 160 kilometers. This gave the Royal Air Force, RAF, about 19 minutes to scramble their Spitfires, climb to altitude and intercept the enemy. But against the Horten Ho 229, because of its smaller radar return and its incredibly high speed, 977 km/h, the radar would not pick it up until it was 80 miles, 129 kilometers away. Wait, 100 miles versus 80 miles. That doesn't sound like a big difference, but you have to factor in the speed. The Horten was moving so much faster than a regular bomber that the warning time for the British would drop from 19 minutes to just 8 minutes. 8 minutes. It takes a Spitfire pilot more than 8 minutes just to climb to 20,000 feet. This means that by the time the British radar operators screamed incoming, the Hortens would already be over London, dropping their bombs and turning for home. The RAF fighters would still be climbing on the runway, helpless. Tom DeBrenz, the Northrop stealth expert, looked at the data and admitted it would have been a game changer. It wasn't Star Trek invisible, but it was stealthy enough to break the British air defense network. The test proved that Reimar Horten wasn't lying. He had stumbled upon the principles of stealth technology 30 years before the Americans coined the term. The replica still sits in a warehouse in California today, a testament to a terrifying what-if. If Hitler had mass-produced these in 1944, instead of wasting resources on V-2 rockets, the air war over Europe might have ended very differently. But the story has one final twist. While the Americans took the plane and the companies took the ideas, what happened to the men? Reimar and Walter Horten survived the war, but they didn't go to NASA like von Braun. Their ending was far more bitter. 1948. Europe is rebuilding from the ashes. The Horten Ho 229 is locked away in a dark warehouse in America, but the dream of the flying wing did not die in that warehouse. While the Americans were studying his machines, Reimar Horten, the genius mathematician behind the design, escaped the chaos of post-war Germany. He didn't go to the USA like Wernher von Braun. He didn't go to Russia. He vanished into South America. Reimar settled in Argentina under the protection of Juan Perón's government. He wasn't looking for a quiet retirement. He wanted to prove the world wrong. He wanted to build the perfect wing. In a remote workshop in Córdoba, Reimar Horten built one of the strangest aircraft ever seen. It wasn't a bomber. It wasn't a fighter. It was a cargo plane designed to carry oranges. He called it the IRE-38 Naranjero, the orange carrier. It was a massive four-engine flying wing. It looked like a giant, clumsy cousin of the sleek Ho 229. Reimar's logic was pure efficiency. A flying wing creates less drag, burns less fuel, and can carry cheaper fruit to Buenos Aires. But the curse of the Hortens followed him. The engines were underpowered. The project was cancelled. The Naranjero was abandoned at the edge of an airfield, rotting away just like the wooden jet in Germany. Reimar Horten spent the rest of his life in Argentina, watching from a distance as the world slowly caught up to his ideas. He saw the Americans launch the B-2 Spirit in 1989. He saw the rise of stealth drones. He died in 1994 on a ranch in Villa General Belgrano, still believing that he was the true father of modern stealth. And perhaps he was right. Today, if you visit the Udvar Hazy Center in Virginia, you can see the original Horten Ho 229 V3. It is currently being restored by the Smithsonian. They are not repainting it. They are preserving the original charred wood, the rusted steel, and the layers of carbon-infused glue. It sits there like a silent warning from history. It is a reminder of how close Nazi Germany came to a technological breakthrough that could have prolonged the war. But it is also a monument to the terrifying neutrality of physics. The laws of aerodynamics don't care about politics. The perfect shape for an airplane is the same for a tyrant in 1944 as it is for a democracy in 2024. The Horten brothers were on the wrong side of history, but they were on the right side of science. They dreamed of a tailless future. And today, when you look up and see a B-21 Raider or a cutting-edge drone slicing through the sky, you are looking at the ghost of the Horten Ho 229. The Bat finally won. This brings us to the end of our investigation into the Nazi stealth fighter. We have uncovered the wood, the charcoal glue, and the secret tests in the desert, but history is full of these impossible machines. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think the US Air Force stole the design for the B-2 Spirit, or was it just parallel evolution? And most importantly, what mystery should we investigate next? Thank you for watching The War Forge. I'll see you in the comments section.